Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the Electric Vehicles and Building Electrification webinar today. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be sent out to all attendees. If there are any issues with audio, please write me in the chat. My name is Erica DeLello and I'm a project manager for Noresco. This series is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by CEO, Colorado Mozingo Code Group, and Sweep. We've been working with the Colorado Energy Office to provide trainings just like this one. And here on this next slide, we have a list of trainings that are offered in this Wednesday webinar series over the next few months. There will be a link sent out in a follow-up email if you'd like to register for any of these other webinars. Also, we are offering tailored group trainings or technical assistance for jurisdictions that are updating I-codes. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. In addition, we've put together a code adoption toolkit that reviews cost implications of changing code cycles, the benefits, and other compliance resources. We've also created a troubleshooting guide that covers I-code conflicts and alignments, clarifications, and passive compliance. Both of these resources can be accessed through the Colorado Energy Office's website. So throughout the webinar, we do want to encourage questions. So please write them in the Q&A function. Use the Q&A function to write in those questions, and I'll let our presenters know at the end. The chat window can be used to chat among participants, but please use the Q&A function if you'd like to ask a question. There is also the ability to raise your hand to ask a question. At the end of the presentation, I can then unmute you and you can ask the speakers directly. And then lastly, there's a survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. If you could please take a moment to provide feedback, that'd be great, so we can continue to improve on these webinars. And has been a slight change in today's presentation, and we actually have 4 presenters to cover all the topics. Shauna Mozingo from Mozingo Code Group, Christine Brinker and Matt Fromer from Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, and Zach Owens from the Colorado Energy Office. So we've got a great panel today. And with that, I'll let Shauna kick us off.
All right, well, it's not gonna let me share my screen. There we go.
Got it?
All right. All right, hopefully that's working for you.
Yep.
Thank you so much for allowing us to present. We do have, as Erica said, a little bit of a change, just simply because the code changed. So as we were creating this presentation, we were still in the middle of writing the code, and we were looking at the IECC 2021 and what was going to be in there. And so we were going to present to you today what will be in the 2021 code. However, there's been an appeal. There was an appeals process for the 2021, and so people weren't expecting that what we had put in the code would come back out, and so at the end, I'll talk to you a little bit more about the appeals process, but what I really wanted to talk to you about is really going ahead, whether or not it's in the code, you could still create your plan. And I have a lot of jurisdictions that are writing me and calling me and emailing me, asking me if we would help them get to their sustainability goals, help them write a code that will get them to their goals, whether it's by 2030, 35, 2040, whatever it is, they have these goals to get to. And so we're still being asked to write them. And we still can most certainly include all of these things, especially building electrification and electric vehicles. To me, right now, are the most requested parts of code that people are asking us to write, believe it or not. So I want to just make sure that you know that we can still get these into the code by figuring out what are your goals, what is it that you're able to do in your jurisdiction. Do you have some sustainability goals, net zero goals, carbon footprint goals? And figuring out what those are, what you're able to do, what's already in the code for other codes, and determining where we need to put this. A lot of jurisdictions are, okay, well, maybe if if the appeals hearing said it shouldn't go in the energy code, maybe it goes into a different code, or maybe it does. You feel it does fit your energy code. The IECC board of directors said that they felt it was outside the scope, but that they felt that also that the scope just needs to be rewritten so that we can include these kinds of things in the future. So maybe we can rewrite your scope. What does that look like? What can we do? Do our research on what are the costs? What are the things out there that other people are doing? And we're going to learn a lot of that today. The presenters that we have have some amazing information. I had the chance to review their slides first. Utilize your resources. Don't reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of jurisdictions that have already started this process, that are already including it. We do have the language that was going to be to the 2021 code, so we can use that language. And so there are a lot of things that people are doing all over the country that we can include. So utilize your resources. Who can help us? That's what I'm excited to have Zach on here from the state to talk to us about what maybe the state can help with also. And then, create that plan. Doesn't have, whether it's in the code or not, you create your plan. Create what it looks like in your code. And then you also have to decide who's going to enforce it. Who's going to look at electric vehicle charging? Who's going to look at building electrification? And what does that look like? What are your resources within your department? Do you have buy-in from other departments? Because planning and zoning will likely have to be involved in some other people. So making sure you have all of that lined up, and then maybe an implementation plan of how to make it work. How do we get from this idea, this plan, and put it into action? Do we do it all at once? Do we implement it a little bit at a time? Whatever you want, we are here to help. The state has funding for us to help you take these goals and put them all the way through to put them into action. So let us know how we can help you. We are here for any or all of those steps down the way. So right now I'm going to quit talking and I'm going to turn it over to Christine, who's going to talk to us about building electrification and what other people are doing.
Thanks, Shauna. Thanks, Erica. Hello, everybody. Glad to see everyone on here today. I'll let you in on a little secret to start with. I love talking about electrification and codes and local energy policy. So this is just perfect for me. And I think the same goes for Erica and Shauna and Zach and Matt. So we're all certainly really excited to be here talking about this. It's getting so much buzz lately, and it's really taking off. And things are changing daily. So it's a pretty exciting field to be in. Shauna, next slide. I'm at the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, or SWEEP. I've been here forever, a couple of decades maybe, and SWEEP is one of 6 different regional energy efficiency organizations that work on promoting greater energy efficiency. So we cover all the southwestern states. And I work on buildings efficiency. I'm in a huge 2-person team, me and Jim Myers. Jim was supposed to do the webinar today, but he had a last minute funeral to go to. So I'm filling in for him. But if I mention Jim, you'll know at least who I'm talking about. Next slide. What is electrification? Just so we can make sure we all get on the same page. I think probably most of you know this, but just to cover it, electrification, it basically means moving from appliances or equipment or vehicles that would otherwise run on a fossil fuel, such as natural gas or propane or fuel oil, or in the case of cars, gasoline or diesel, and then moving to clean and efficient electric versions of those same technologies. Next slide. And then you often hear the word beneficial electrification, and that just adds the qualification that it also has to do some beneficial good for society or for consumers or for businesses. And so the definition that originally basically came from Regulatory Assistance Project is this, that it has to do at least one of the following: either save consumers money over time, or reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or provide some other environmental benefit there, or improve product quality or consumers' quality of life, or finally foster a more robust and resilient grid. So as long as it does at least one of those, we call it beneficial electrification. Next slide. And why are we hearing about this now? It's basically a convergence of all of those four things that I just mentioned that are moving from a wish list to actually happening on the ground. Starting with incredible advancements in the technology itself. And I got to tell you, it's rare that we see in the energy efficiency field technologies advance quite this quickly. Um, Obviously, our phones and so forth move along quite quickly, but other technologies that we usually work with, not so much. So, information on electric and new electric technologies that we had just a couple years ago is now outdated information. And you still see and hear a lot of that outdated information floating around there. So that's something to be aware of. For instance, a lot of contractors putting in air source heat pumps will say, oh, those don't work because they can't get down to the cold temperatures that we have here in Colorado. And that might have been true 5 years ago, and it is not true anymore. Now heat pumps can get down to minus 22 degrees. And even within the systems themselves, they can have electric coils so they can go down to however far down you need them to go. So the information itself is changing. Make sure you have the latest there. And similarly, the costs have plummeted along with what you'd have expect with technology adoption and advancement. And then similarly, another converging factor at the same time, Shauna was mentioning that many, if not most, if not all cities now have sustainability plans or climate action plans, and electrification is increasingly one of those components. And the reason is because buildings, homes and buildings themselves are such a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Typically, you find it in the 40 something percent. So 40 something percent of a city's greenhouse gas emissions would be from homes and buildings. And another big, huge chunk obviously would be from vehicles. So that's why we'll hear from Matt and Zach after this. So addressing those greenhouse gas emissions in buildings is a key goal of those climate action plans. And electrification is not the only way to get there, but it's becoming increasingly clear that it is the clearest path forward, the most expedient path forward there. And that's going hand in hand with the growth in renewables. It's been surprising, but also not surprising for all of us to see the trajectory that renewables have taken, how the costs have fallen, how the installations have grown over time. What we predicted, over the last few decades is actually happening and has happened. Now we find renewables um, being offered at lower prices than other resources on the grid. For instance, when Excel put out their um, call for new generation of any sort, they got bids for wind, solar, and storage together that came in cheaper not only than natural gas plants, but also cheaper than running their existing coal plants um, that are already in place. So that availability and prevalence of renewables is why electrification is now making sense. Whereas 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it wouldn't have made as much sense environmentally. If it's being fueled by all coal plants, then the emissions equation doesn't shake out the right way. It's the same way with cars, of course, which probably Matt and Zach will talk about. And then that also ties into utilities um, load management. They not only have emissions goals to meet, but they're also working on, of course, maintaining their electric load. As far as emission goals, for instance, Excel's is they've promised to reduce their emissions 80% by 2030, which is not all that far away, and then 100% carbon free by 2050. So the pace of electric utility renewable adoption is keeping pace with electrification. So sometimes we've heard either the question or the concern about why should we all move to electric if the grid is dirty? How is that saving anything? And the answer is that the grid is getting cleaner and cleaner and cleaner over time. And the other kind of electric utility question or concern we get all the time is, are utilities going to have enough capacity for all this extra um, needs from these electric technologies? And the answer there is that they're still kind of keeping pace with each other. If everyone adopted electric technologies overnight, then the utilities might not have enough capacity, but they are fully aware of this movement and this trend. And in many cases, they're behind it, pushing it, encouraging it. And so they're adding capacity at a rate which keeps up with electrification. Um, and as proof of utilities involvement and enthusiasm in electrification, they're increasingly offering rebates and incentives. And we expect in the coming year and in the next few years as well for those rebates and incentives to go up quite a bit more. That's what we're seeing in their demand side management plans and energy efficiency plans, more incentives for there. And then going along with that, all the other pieces to make electrification work, such as marketing of it to help get the education and the outreach out there about these new technologies, and a lot of contractor training, which of course is going to be increasingly important. Because I was talking with a friend the other day who used to work for an HVAC installer, and he said their common refrain is that they sell what they stock and they stock what they sell. So it will certainly take some training for all the contractors, and there are hundreds and thousands of small HVAC companies all across our states, to bring them up to speed to these new technologies. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of impressions out there are outdated, even if they're only from a couple years ago, about these are way too expensive, these can't perform in our region. And now we've since learned that neither of those are the case. Next slide. So now, even though we're only starting to hear the word electrification in the past couple of years, already a quarter of households in the US are completely all electric. That varies by region, of course. In the South, it's about half and half. And out here in the West, it's about 20% of houses that are already all electric. So it's not cutting edge whatsoever. It's just that we have some of these new technologies that now make it a more viable option, both from the cost side and the environmental side, as well as, I guess you could say, the comfort side too. And maybe I should have said earlier, but what we're specifically talking about here usually are heat pumps for space heating, heat pump water heaters, induction stoves, and then dryers are another one that could be fueled by either electricity or natural gas. So we throw that one in there as well. And when I say that they're already widespread and cost effective, of course, that doesn't mean they're cost effective in every single situation. There are a lot of nuances to when and where they're cost effective. It depends. Is it new construction? Is it existing buildings? Is it, what are you changing from? What are you changing to? So there's a lot of factors there, and we could do an entire webinar on just looking at the cost, but there are a lot of applications where we can definitively say it is cost effective already today. We can do that in the Q&A if we have any more time to dive into that. And just a refresher for heat pumps, because I hear a lot of confusion out there for what they are. The first thing is that a lot of people are more familiar for some reason with ground source heat pumps than with air source heat pumps. Ground source, obviously, where you're drawing heat or cooling, depending on the season, from underground. You dig pipes into your yard or your land around your building. And that is still available. It does still work. It's pretty expensive, but it can be right in the right application. But having said that, typically now when we're talking about heat pumps, we're talking about air source heat pumps, and they're very simple. It's just a refrigerator that can work in either direction. You pull heat from one place, you put it into another. So it depends, if do you want heating in your house, then you're pulling the heat from outside and moving it into your house. Do you want cooler air? Well, then you're pulling heat from your house and spitting it outside, so you're now left with cooler air. It's very simple. Same with heat pump water heaters. You're pulling heat from the air, putting it into the water, and then spitting out the cooler air. So I went back and forth late last night when I was finishing up my slides if I wanted to show you pictures of my actual heat pump and heat pump water heater, because I got them in April and I am so proud of them, and I like to show them off to absolutely anybody who will listen, any captive audience. But I eventually decided to go with a pretty marketing pictures, because just a regular basement picture didn't show it off well enough. But on the left, an air source heat pump, on the right, a heat pump water heater. And I should say about the one on the left, that's kind of a typical stock image that you see, with that little unit up there. But newer models can just have a plain old vent that you barely see, either towards the ground or in floor or in the ceiling. So you don't need that wall mounted unit if you don't want to. You can also do a ducted system if you prefer. If you're in an existing house that already has ducts, that's what we ended up doing. But if you do one of these without ducts in new construction, you get much higher ceilings because you don't need the ducts. That's turning out to be a really high selling point for these. Okay, next slide. One quick word about induction stoves. We have found that when you're talking about heaters or water heaters, no one really cares if it's gas or electric or what, as long as it works, as long as it's safe and affordable and reliable and clean enough. But with stoves, there's a lot more passion that you hear with some people really in love with and tied to their gas stove, despite that the newer technologies, induction stoves, are actually faster to heat water. They're safer because you can just put your hands straight on at the burner and not be burned. They're more precise, they're more efficient, and they're cleaner. By cleaner, I mean indoor air quality. And the studies have come out in the past, 6 months or a year or so, detailing the harmful pollutants coming from gas stoves. But having said that, there is still remaining a lot of consumer resistance and therefore builder resistance to putting in induction stoves, or I should say not putting in gas stoves. And that's why, as we're talking about codes, a number of jurisdictions that are moving towards all electric codes might end up just exempting gas stoves, just to make it easier politically to get it through. Okay, next slide. So we have a few dozen communities that have put into their codes a movement towards electrification. If you say to yourself, I bet those are all in California, you would be mostly right. There's, when I looked a few months ago, it was in the high 30s. So maybe there's over 40 now, some cities that have electrification in their codes. There are a handful of other places too around the country, not just California. Massachusetts is moving in that direction. We have Boulder just up the road from where I am, and others. And then this is next slide. One thing that my colleague Jim detailed in his report was some little case studies of a lot of these cities that have put in electrification in their codes. And what we learned is not only that there's a lot of them and a growing number of them, but there's big cities, little cities, lots of construction, not much construction, greenfield development, brownfield development, and all of them managed to find some flavor of electrification that worked for them. Next slide. And they all fell into this spectrum. It's not simple. It's not black and white. It's not all or nothing. There are some jurisdictions that said electric only, end of story. But there's a lot of other nuances and different variables for putting electrification in your codes. The one place to start is with incentives. That can be financial incentives like rebates or incentives, but it'll also be other things the city could offer towards incentives, such as expedited permitting or reduced permit fees. That's, for instance, what the city of Denver is doing to incentivize builders to move towards its voluntary green code, which in 2021 is set to become its base code. So they're trying to find ways to encourage builders to test it out ahead of when it's mandatory. Then you have everything in between. Some, as I mentioned, would be all electric except for gas stoves. Some might just start with certain types of buildings, just offices or just townhomes or something like that. Start with easier ones and then move into harder ones. What is increasingly common is right there in the middle, electric preferred, which means that in the code, they write in some extra efficiency requirements for homes or buildings that have natural gas as a kind of as a way to tilt the balance towards electrification and also to offset some of the extra emissions and that come from the natural gas. So that one is increasingly common. Sorry, I know I'm jumping all over this scale here, but the last one, electric ready, is just making sure new construction has all the wiring in it. This is just as important for transportation as it is for these building systems, so that if a consumer or a building owner or homeowner wants to put in these technologies later, they don't have to completely rip up their walls and redo all their wiring and paneling. That's already there. They can just make an easy switch. So next slide. Skip one over, will you, Shauna? My bottom line recommendation, if you want to take a step towards electrification, but you're not ready to go all electric, then put in some electric preferred language into your codes, or at a minimum, at least electric ready, so that when people want to move over to these technologies, they can. That was, as Shauna mentioned, that was going to be in the 2021, but it was removed by the board in the final decision. I think there still will be a lot of jurisdictions that still adopt the language that was approved by the majority of governmental voting members. But we'll also wait and see how and where it's reintroduced into either the energy code or other codes in the 2024. So we'll find out. And then back up one slide, Shauna. So this language is available in Jim's report, sample language on each of those different options on the spectrum, from electric preferred, electric only, everything in there for both commercial and for residential that you can just cut and paste to make it as easy as possible. So that's a good resource for everyone. I think that's my last slide, but can you check? Yep, that is. All right. Thanks. I'll take any questions probably at the end, and I'll pass it back to Shauna.
And thanks, Christine. We're going to jump right in and let Matt take over with the EV.
All right. Thank you. My name is Matt Fromer. I work at Sweep with Christine, but I'm on the transportation team. Today I'm going to talk about EV infrastructure or EV ready building codes. You can go next slide. Yeah, so here's a photo I took in my neighborhood. This is an EV. I think it's a Volvo X90. And this is what we're trying to avoid, is these wires running from someone's home across the sidewalk and onto the street to charge their vehicles. So what we want is to equip new buildings with EV infrastructure and allow people to install EV charging stations easily next to their homes and their parking spaces. You can go to the next slide. And just as a starting point, here's the scale of the EV infrastructure challenge. So on the left there, we have a table showing the projected electric vehicle adoption in Colorado over the next 10 years. We are currently at about 30,000 EVs. So this is the numbers from 2019. Hopefully we can get to 43, 45,000 by the end of 2020. And then we see a pretty aggressive ramp up in EV adoption over the next 10 years in the high adoption scenario to 1 million EVs on the road, which would be close to 15% of all vehicles. In order to hit our House Bill 1261 climate goals, our greenhouse gas reduction goals, we probably need to be even more aggressive than this. And as you know, Colorado is a ZEV state, a clean car state. So we've adopted the California Clean Car Standards, requiring the big automakers to sell EVs in our state, and ramping up the percentage of sales each year starting in 2023. California just updated their goals and actually banned the sale of gasoline vehicles in 2035. So 15 years from now, 100% of light duty vehicles need to be electric. And Colorado and the 10 other ZEV states will likely follow that trajectory. So in order to support all those new EVs, we need a lot more EV charging stations. And this map on the right sort of shows the gap in charging infrastructure in the major metro areas across the country. As you can see in the Denver metro area, today we have about 20 or 30% of the total charging ports we need to serve the anticipated number of EVs in 2025. So we need to build a lot more charging stations. Next slide. So why adopt EV infrastructure building codes? A couple main reasons here. First is to help overcome the critical barrier to EV adoption by facilitating EV charging infrastructure. So if we look at surveys time and again, the number one reason people don't buy EVs is because they don't have access to EV charging either at home or in public or their place of work. And then second is to avoid the high cost of retrofitting a building with EV charging infrastructure. And I'll go into some of the cost implications later. Next slide. So yeah, like I said, wow, what does it say, India? Oh, I did give this presentation to a group in India about a month ago because they're interested in this concept as well. No, it should say Colorado needs more EV charging stations to accelerate the EV market. And like I said, the second bullet point there, 6 in 10 Americans are unlikely to buy an EV because there are not enough places to charge. Number one barrier there. I guess looking at this table on the right, this is from Xcel Energy's most recent TEP filing at the Public Utilities Commission, where they anticipate building about 225,000 EV chargers in the next 10 years, and that's up from 15,000 today. So about a 15-fold increase in the number of charging ports in Xcel's territory. Yeah. And I just wanted to point out that all this is supported by announcements from the major global automakers. So here's just a list of the biggest 12, and you can see for Volvo, 50% of sales electric by 2025. For Ford, 40 EV models on the market by 2022. We're seeing some of those like the Ford electric Mach-E Mustang coming to market at the end of this year. And then what's the other one? I like to point out the Honda. So 2/3 of sales to be electric by 2030. So they have these goals. They're bringing more EVs to market every year, including the crossover SUVs and electric pickups that Coloradans want to buy. Next slide. So, electric transportation does really require sort of a fundamental shift in the way we think about fueling vehicles. Today, we're very used to driving to a gas station. It takes 2 minutes to fill up on gasoline or diesel, and then you drive away. It's all done in public. With EVs, most of the charging stations, in fact, 92% of the chargers are at home. And about 70% of the electricity delivered to EVs is at home. We have all this electric grid infrastructure, as Christine explained. We have the generation, transmission, distribution to these buildings. And really all we need to do is plug in these vehicles where they tend to sit for the longest amount of time, which is at home, at the workplace, and then at certain, in public settings like retail, shopping centers. And then in combination, we also need these DC fast chargers. These are capable of fully recharging a vehicle in about 45 minutes today. We're seeing some of the new Tesla superchargers can fully recharge a Tesla in about 10 to 15 minutes. So that technology is coming along very quickly. And these really enable longer road trips, say to access ski resorts in Colorado off I-70. And Zach will talk about that a bit later, perhaps. One statistic is that 50% of Americans do not have access to a dedicated off-street parking space at their residence. Maybe they have on-street parking, like in certain areas of Denver, or they live in multifamily housing, where they have maybe a shared parking situation, a parking garage or surface parking. And for these people, it's really hard to get access to EV charging. Both logistically, they're working with an HOA, landlord. There's a split incentive for renters as well, and maybe you're not going to live in one place for more than a couple years. So why make that investment in EV charging? And there's also different parking configurations. There can be shared where all the parking spaces are open. It's kind of first come, first serve. And then there's also deeded or designated parking where you have one parking space per residential unit. So all these challenges we need to think about, and really providing this EV infrastructure at the time of new construction really allows people to install those charging stations really easily and also at a lower cost. Next slide. And speaking of cost, this is some estimates from California, where they've had these EV-ready building codes in place for 4 or 5 years now. In the bold there, you see if EV-capable parking spaces are installed during new construction, you're saving between $2,000 and $4,600 per parking space over a retrofit scenario. On the right there, some cost model for the city of Oakland. The blue plus the green bars represent the cost to install EV infrastructure during a standalone retrofit, versus just the blue sliver at the bottom there is to install it during new construction. You can imagine if you live, say, in an apartment building and you want to install an EV charging station in your parking space, finding out that it's going to cost, upwards of $6,000 just to bring the service from the panel to your parking space because of all the demolition, reconstruction, all the trenching costs involved with running that service. And that's before you even install buy the charging station or the electric vehicle. Next slide. Another study in California estimated the total cost as a percentage of the total construction cost for multifamily residential and some commercial buildings as well, and found that it's just a fraction of a percent to install. This is, I think, for 10% of parking spaces to be EV ready. Next slide. So to go through some of the code specifications, these are the different definitions we've seen in codes. There's EV capable, which is kind of the first level. And that's really just the electric panel capacity and the branch circuit or raceway. So basically just the raceway conduit running from the panel to the parking space. There's EV ready, which is a full circuit from the panel to the parking space. And generally, in terms of the power requirements, we're talking about a 40 amp, 240 volt service. That's for level 2 charging. That's basically capable of fully recharging a Chevy Bolt overnight in like 6 to 8 hours. And then the last one, if you're ambitious, and Denver, Summit County are, you might have an EV installed requirement. So in case of Denver, 5% of parking spaces in multifamily, residential, and commercial must have an EV charging station installed during new construction. And that's great because it provides that visibility for residents and customers. They have an EV charging station where they park their vehicle. And so if they want to buy an electric vehicle, they can. They'll have access to charging. Next slide. So I've been trying to keep track over the years of all the local EV-ready building codes around the country. I think I'm counting upwards of 40, but there seems to be more every week. But here are just a few from Colorado. You got Denver, Boulder, Golden, and Fort Collins. And you could see the requirements for single family, multifamily, and commercial. And then some of the larger cities around the country, Seattle, San Jose, and Vancouver have their requirements. And At the bottom there is the proposal we submitted for the 2021 IECC model code. And as Shauna said, and she'll hopefully elaborate on later, that did make it through the committee and through the online voting process. It seemed to be approved sort of beginning of the year with 70% of the ICC members voting in favor of residential EV requirements and 82% voting in favor of commercial requirements. But then there was a last minute appeal from the home builders and some of the natural gas associations that was ultimately successful in reversing the decision. But that sample language, was vetted. We took 2 years really to develop and defend those code requirements. And I think they're really strong as sort of a baseline, communities that are just starting with EV ready building codes. So for single family residential, requiring 1 parking space per dwelling unit to be EV ready. So that's the full circuit. For multifamily and commercial, requiring 2 spaces to be EV ready. And then of the remainder, 20% to be EV capable. And that's where we're seeing most of the cost savings is in that with that EV capable requirement. Next slide. Here's a slide from City of Denver with their EV ready building code requirements for group R on top there. And you can see they're going above and beyond here. So 5% of spaces need to be EVSE installed, so charging station installed during new construction. 15% need to be EV ready with the circuit, and then the remainder need to be EV capable. For commercial, they lowered those requirements a bit and kind of focused them on specific commercial groups, recognizing that this may not make sense in every scenario, maybe some retail, but in large part, where there are businesses and people are parking their vehicles for the majority of the day, 8 or 9 hours while they're working, it really makes sense to have charging, especially if those people live in, again, in multifamily housing and probably don't have access to EV charging at home. So in this case, 5% EV installed, and then 10% EV ready and 10% EV capable. Next slide. And yeah, here's just the map I put together earlier this week showing which communities have adopted local EV ready building codes. So far my count's at 10. I'm sure we'll add a few more communities by the end of the year, hopefully. And be happy to share any of this code language for anyone who's interested. Should also mention that, while the building codes are one pathway to getting these EV requirements, in operation, there is a second path, which is some cities outside Colorado, such as Seattle, Chicago, and Atlanta, have pursued this pathway of just passing a local municipal ordinance, either the city council or the county commission, requiring a certain percentage of new parking spaces to have EV ready infrastructure. So be happy to share that language as well. I know the code adoption cycle is every 3 or 6 years, and some of us are impatient to get these EV requirements moving along. So yeah, this is my last slide, and there's my email address, so feel free to reach out and I could share any sample code language, any studies about the cost implications, or any of the rationale for pursuing EV ready building codes. We have those materials available.
Excellent. Thanks, Matt. You've done so much work at the local, state, and national level. We owe a lot to you on this subject, so thank you very much. Everybody be sure to send him questions if you have them. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Zach now with the state of Colorado, and just let us know what state's got in mind for us, Zach.
Thank you, Shauna. I appreciate it. Can you hear me okay? Just doing an audio check.
Yep, it's good.
Awesome. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about EV readiness planning. We talked a little bit earlier and heard from the previous speakers about sustainability plans, and now we are really starting to see a new trend emerge, which is actual EV readiness plans at local and municipal levels. If you could go to the next slide, please, Shauna. So just some background information. In 2020, we released the latest update of the state EV plan, which really has the vision of a large-scale transition to 100% electrification of both light-duty electric vehicles as well as medium and heavy-duty electric vehicles. And so from the state perspective, electrification of the transportation sector is a huge priority for us to help meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so it was important for us to include this in our EV plan at the state level. If you could go to the next slide, please, Shauna. So I won't go into a lot of detail about the EV plan. I invite you to read it. We can provide a link to the full plan in the chat here. But a couple of the main goals I wanted to highlight, we do have that vision of 940,000 or nearly 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. We also have a roadmap to 100% electrification of the light duty fleet in Colorado. So while we have that vision, we're also simultaneously working on a roadmap on how to achieve that vision. And so something I want to articulate today is that, the opportunity to integrate these EV codes in local jurisdiction code adoption processes is a really critical strategy for us to help meet these goals and objectives. Next slide, please, Shauna. And again, just high level, these are the action plan categories within the EV plan. And I'll really be focusing on kind of number one, the policy planning and guidance component, as well as number two, we have some funding opportunities available to assist with these planning efforts. Next slide, please. And again, specifically within the EV plan, and I've kind of highlighted it in red here, we have the actions to develop an advanced building code adoption toolkit. So both Christine and Matt mentioned that earlier in their presentations. We have links available to this on CO's website. There's actual written material to some of these code recommendations that Matt described. And so that's a resource for local governments. But in addition, our office is now providing grants to support local EV readiness planning. And so I'm going to spend the rest of my few minutes here talking about this process. If you could please go to the next slide, Shauna. So what's in an EV readiness plan? These are some of the critical components that we see within an EV readiness plan. It's really about developing that shared vision in a local community for EV readiness and community goals and objectives, outlining the community context and a description of how the plan aligns with other goals and contexts. So, in some cases, there's already an existing sustainability plan. In other cases, there may not be an existing sustainability plan. So kind of doing that asset analysis and linking it to the EV goals as well. We like to see a baseline of the existing EV market, a description of barriers, and then really critical is developing a stakeholder and public engagement strategy so that you really bring critical stakeholders together within the community to develop this plan. Then we like to see goals for infrastructure deployment, and finally policy and programs to increase adoption. And I think that's really where we see synergies with what we've been talking about today. How can we ensure there are EV ready building codes as a strategy within these local EV readiness plans as well? If you could go to the next slide, please, Shauna. So when we wrote this plan and released it in April of 2020, this is just a snapshot of the plans we're aware of at the time across the state that have developed local EV readiness strategies. So Fort Collins is often listed as one of the ones folks are most familiar with, but Aspen, Westminster, Boulder, and Denver also had plans. And then at the time that we released the state EV plan, Pueblo, Colorado Springs, and Estes Park had received grants from DOLA to start their own EV planning processes, and those are actually underway right now. So the plans are not complete, but the stakeholder engagement process is underway. Next slide, please, Shauna. So simultaneously to DOLA having some grant funding for this and the state releasing the new EV plan, we developed a new initiative at the Energy Office to kind of increase availability of grant funding for this initiative. And so our office does have funding for local governments and their regional partners to develop their own EV readiness plans. And similar to what I talked about that are included in those goals and objectives of an EV plan, you could bring stakeholders together, identify key partnerships, actionable strategies, and kind of synthesize all of these EV goals in one common document. And then, something I like to highlight, we really encourage local governments to leverage the resources in the Advanced Building Code Adoption Toolkit and integrate those strategies for consideration with our stakeholders and ideally get them into those local plans as well. And so this fiscal year, our office has provided grants to Steamboat Springs, Durango, and Pueblo County. And so they're also starting their local EV readiness stakeholder engagement processes for their plans. And we continue to have funding available. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that opportunity. We will provide up to a 50% cost share, up to $20,000 to communities to develop their EV readiness plans. And the funding is available for third-party services only. So unfortunately, we can't fund existing staff time, for staff members of the local government. It does need to be a contracted service. But there's flexibility in terms of where that match comes from. So we do consider DOLA match as eligible. In some cases, utilities are bringing funding to the table. If there are other grants, gifts, donations that the local government can achieve or provide, and then public and private entities could also provide match to the project. And this is not a competitive grant. Funds are distributed on a first come, first served basis. So if you're a part of a local government or a local community that wants to get involved and leverage this funding, please contact me after this presentation so we could start the conversation. Next slide, please. And realize I'm getting tight on time, so I might go quickly here, but again, please follow up with me if you have any questions after the discussion today. We like to see an interest from the local government, itself in EV readiness planning. If there are community members or local EV clubs that show a passion for this, we love to get their engagement in the process. We also look at the population center and if there's an opportunity for significant adoption of EVs to help the state meet its goals. But it's really, a communication process with the Energy Office. Let's have some discussions and talk about what an appropriate scope is for your community, and that will inform the scope of work for the award. Next slide, please. So the applicant must be a local or county government. So it's critical to have, kind of a lead or a champion in the local government that could spearhead this process. The plans must be regional in nature. And the stakeholder engagement process is really important to us, making sure, you're outreaching to key demographics as the plan is developed. And then we will be looking for semi-annual updates on both the plan, but also the implementation of the plan and the goals that are achieved. And I believe this is my last slide. Like I said, this is not a competitive process. It's first come, first serve. So contact us to get started. Typically we'll have a few meetings between the Energy Office and key contacts in the local government to scope out the vision for the plan, make sure, kind of match is secured. And at that point, we'll work with the local government to put an official application together, just to make sure we're kind of on the same page with the scope of work and the contracting services, and then we'll proceed with executing the grant. So on the next slide is my contact information. Please email me if you're interested in this process. We would love to engage more local communities across the state to increase the number of local EV readiness plans in Colorado. So thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Zach. That's awesome. It's great for us to hear what jurisdictions want to do. And, we were hoping that the code process would help us out, but it's nice to know that the code, we don't have to rely on the code process, right? There's help out there. Right? So it's nice to know that it's not impossible. It's not an impossible task to get building electrification and to get EV ready out there. It's great to know that the state is offering some help and some incentives. The utilities are starting to come around with some incentives. Jurisdictions are starting to come around with incentives. So it's really great. Nothing is impossible unless you say it's impossible, right? This is what I tell myself every day. Everything's impossible once I think it is. So it's just good to know. I want to touch real quick on just that code development process. So we did, we did see that this all went through, like Matt said, this all went through the process, got all the way to the end, and made it through. We thought that it was in there. We started adding it to people. People wanted to adopt the 2018 code, and we went ahead and helped them get the 2021 wording into their 2018 code so that they could they could be ready for it. And that would just be one less thing that they had to do in 2021. They would already be there. I'm just saying that's still possible, right? You can still put this in there. We thought it was in there. It went through all the processes through two committee hearings, or a committee hearing, a final election hearing, and the online vote, and made it in, and then got appealed at the end. So anything that gets put into the code is allowed to be appealed. The National Association of Home Builders, the Leading Builders of America, and then the natural gas associations got together and filed an appeal and said that they felt that electric vehicles and electric readiness was outside of the scope of the Energy Conservation Code, that it wasn't about conserving energy. It went through several hearings, a couple of hearings there. And then ultimately there was an appeals committee that agreed that maybe it wasn't under the current scope as written in the Energy Code. And so it went to the Board of Directors, the ICC Board of Directors. The ICC Board of Directors said, yep, it's we're going to agree that it's not under the current scope, but they made recommendations that the current scope get reevaluated. And so that is on the agenda for the upcoming code cycle, which has already begun. We're already writing their 2024 right now. And so it's good to know that the board is not saying that these don't belong in the code. They're saying that it doesn't belong under the scope. Let's redo the scope. So I just want to encourage Matt and the others who want this in their code to not be discouraged. It did go past all the voting members and it did make it into the code. It's not that it doesn't belong there. It's they just want the scope to reflect more of that to encompass it. So I don't want people to think it's impossible. I don't want people to think that it shouldn't be in there. We just need to go about it a different way. But what does that do for you right now? If you are wanting electric vehicle language, if you are wanting building electrification language, like I said, there's like Christine pointed out, and that there are a lot of different levels of that, anywhere from jump in both feet or just put your toes in the water. There's a lot of different language out there. We've looked all over the country. We've been involved in what's going on. We have that language available to us. So if you need assistance, please let us know. We're happy to help you put that together. And the state has some adoption assistance available also, and can help with maybe funding if you need some help doing that, or we can include a lot of this maybe in the toolkit. So I'm going to stop now, and I know that with 4 presenters, there's probably some questions coming in, so we will let Erica take back over control and let us know if we have some questions.
Thank you, Shauna, and all of our presenters. That we covered a lot of information today. So I'm sure there are questions. There have been a few coming through in the Q&A chat portion. So one that I do want to read out is that we just had power outages from 2 electric utilities in our area. People are asking how all electric is beneficial in these cases. And our reply is that it happens infrequently, which is not always sufficient. And Christine had a great response that they are infrequent and usually very brief, but also typically with gas furnaces and gas water heaters, they also need electricity to run. So they'll also be blown out during an electrical power outage as well. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that, Christine.
Great.
Yeah, so then otherwise we don't have any other questions, but please, I mean, feel free to message any of our presenters or reach out to me and I will connect you to the right people. But we are just at hitting our hour right now. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll stay on the line for another minute if there are any other questions, but otherwise, thank you all for attending.